All right, everyone, as promised, just a recap here of anaerobic respiration, right? So what's the difference between aerobic and anaerobic? So aerobic respiration uses oxygen, right? And so what we should probably know here is we end up producing lots of ATP, whereas anaerobic respiration, right, uses no oxygen and generates very little ATP, albeit quite quickly, right? But quickly. So we understand the nature of both and why it might be beneficial for an organism to either undergo one or the other. So basically, anaerobic respiration can be referred to as fermentation. So fermentation is anaerobic respiration. Sorry for cramming that in there. All right. And essentially, in the process of fermentation, organisms burn glucose. So we're burning our sugar without oxygen, right? And the process of producing energy in the form of ATP without oxygen is called anaerobic respiration. Respiration without oxygen, right? An or lacking, that prefix. So we've got two types of fermentation. We have alcohol fermentation, and essentially what you want to think about is with no oxygen present, right? With no oxygen available at the end of the electron transport chain, right? Remember? So there's no oxygen available at the end of the electron transport chain. Only a modified glycolysis occurs. Okay, so remember, let's flash back, normal cellular respiration, which we just did, has three stages to it. It's got glycolysis, it has the Krebs cycle, and it has the electron transport chain. But if we take this oxygen, remember the red representing our oxygen, if we take that out of the picture, then none of this or this occur. And so only glycolysis, and it's a slightly modified glycolysis because of the lack of that oxygen. So flashing back here, here's the very basic of the reaction. The glucose is still converted into pyruvate, but what happens, which is kind of an important part of the process, see what we see here is when glucose is converted into the pyruvate, we get some ATP, and in order to convert the glucose into the pyruvate, we're going to produce this NADH. Now, in order for this to keep happening, we've got to regenerate this NAD+. So what happens is the pyruvate breaks down into ethanol and carbon dioxide, and this uses the NADH and regenerates the NAD+, which goes back here and keeps the process happening. So it allows the process to occur quickly, but as you can see, doesn't generate a lot of ATP. So process is quick, but very little ATP. And thus, not very sustainable, right? And that can be more obvious when you consider fermentation in us, right? In which we call it lactic acid fermentation. So lactic acid fermentation is what occurs in animals like us, and that includes, pretty much, well, many organisms, not just us, but this lactic acid fermentation. And the process is essentially the same. Glucose is converted into pyruvate, just like up here, but the pyruvate is then converted into lactic acid. So it's a somewhat different outcome, just different organisms, different outcome, right? Up here, when we're talking about yeast, right? Well, you take oxygen out of the picture for yeast, and they're going to form pyruvate, but then ultimately that pyruvate's converted to ethanol, which is good for us and people like Homer Simpson, right? Or if you're a beer drinker or a wine drinker, a vodka or a gin or whatever is your pleasure. So in our cells, if you starve them of oxygen, they're going to break down glucose, producing the pyruvate. You're going to get some ATP, but again, to kind of keep it going, right? The second step is kind of important, and that's the conversion of the pyruvate into the lactic acid, which regenerates that NAD+. It can go back up here to help drive this reaction, right? This is key as a part of breaking down glucose into the pyruvate, right? And the lactic acid is produced by working muscle cells. And it's the lactic acid that leads to a lot of that, what you'll experience as fatigue in the muscles, and basically what will ultimately incapacitate the muscles or prevent the muscles from functioning as well as this buildup of lactic acid, right? And we kind of talked about that in class, so I'll leave it like that and finish up. That's it. All right, see you tomorrow. Don't forget to print off your Chapter 7 notes.